by scratching the surface, you get a terrible shock. It's it's a heinous crime. People are so shocked by what
Camilla expected another carefully controlled royal meeting. Instead, a sealed directive carrying the authority of the late queen changed everything within minutes. The message was brutally specific. In this dramatized account, her independent access to a defined group of royal residences was being withdrawn under instructions prepared before Elizabeth's death. As the words settled across the room, Camilla did not argue. She simply stared at the page, stunned by a decision from a woman she could no longer confront. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The silence became heavier when Camilla read the central clause again. The decree, a formal written instruction setting out how certain royal household matters should be handled, did not remove her title, public duties, or place beside Charles. It did something more personal. It limited her independent entry to several private or semi-private royal homes, meaning future access would depend on the king, an official invitation, or an approved royal function. That distinction mattered because this was not a public fall from rank. It was a private boundary drawn around places associated with family memory, privilege, and belonging. Charles watched her face change as the meaning settled in. He knew the order had not been drafted during some recent disagreement. It had originated while his mother was still alive, which meant Elizabeth had considered the issue, approved the wording, and left instructions capable of surviving her. Camilla looked toward him, waiting for reassurance. He lowered his eyes. That small movement hurt more than an argument, because she understood he was caught between defending his wife and respecting the final intention of his mother. A senior private secretary then broke the silence through a documented palace briefing prepared for the meeting. He explained that the directive had remained inactive until a succession-related administrative review was completed. A succession review, in plain terms, is the process of checking how duties, access, property arrangements, and household authority should operate after one monarch is succeeded by another. The review had now ended. The condition had been met. No fresh punishment had been created that morning. The old instruction had simply become active. Camilla leaned closer to the page and noticed a handwritten notation attached to the order. Its meaning was unmistakable. Access to certain royal homes must remain connected to the sovereign's invitation, not marital assumption. She read those words twice. Suddenly, the decree no longer felt procedural. It felt personal, deliberate, and carefully protected against future challenge. Camilla finally placed the paper down. She did not ask whether Charles could overturn it. She asked something far more dangerous. Who knew about this before today? The pause that followed told her enough. And once she realized the decree had never truly been hidden from everyone, the shock of losing access gave way to something sharper. The knowledge that people closest to the crown had been carrying Elizabeth's intention for years. The decree wounded Camilla, but it placed Charles in an even more impossible position. One woman had shared his adult life. The other had shaped his understanding of duty from childhood. Now Elizabeth's signature stood between them, and every choice carried a cost. He could challenge the spirit of the order, defend his wife, or preserve his mother's final boundary. Whichever path he chose would reveal something painful about where his deepest loyalty ultimately rested. Charles understood why the residences named in the decree mattered so much. Some were working royal homes used for official duties, while others were tied closely to Elizabeth's private family life, personal memories, and long-protected traditions. A royal residence, in this context, meant a property used by the sovereign or royal family for official or private purposes, not simply a house anyone in the family could treat as their own. That was why the restriction cut deeper than a change in security access. Camilla waited until they were alone before speaking to him. She told the king that losing a key was not what hurt. What hurt was discovering that Elizabeth had apparently imagined a future in which boundaries around her would still be necessary even after the Queen was gone. Charles listened without interrupting. He reached toward the document, then stopped before touching it, as though even that small gesture carried meaning. Charles finally admitted what she already feared. Overriding his mother's explicit instruction would feel like erasing her final judgment, simply because that judgment had become uncomfortable. He did not say Elizabeth was right. He did not say Camilla was wrong. That uncertainty created its own kind of pain, because the Queen Consort could hear the conflict beneath every careful word. William entered the discussion later, with the same restraint. The prince explained in a documented private briefing that he had been warned years earlier that restrictions involving family access could become active after Elizabeth's death. He had never been shown the full wording, but he knew some form of boundary had been prepared. That revelation changed Camilla's expression immediately. The secret was no longer confined to the late monarch and a handful of officials. Camilla pressed him for more. William chose his words carefully and admitted that Anne's name appeared in an administrative note connected to the decree. The document identified her as one of the senior royals permitted to confirm Elizabeth's original intent if anyone later disputed how the order should be interpreted. An administrative note was simply an internal written record used to explain how a decision should be applied. But to Camilla, this one carried enormous emotional weight. The anger inside her began to shift. Charles was no longer the only person she wanted answers from, and William was no longer the central source of her frustration. One question now overshadowed everything else. Why had Elizabeth believed such a restriction was necessary at all? The answer would lead back to a private royal incident the family had never openly discussed. A moment when quiet unease hardened into something permanent. Long before the sealed document reached Camilla's hands, one uncomfortable weekend had already changed Elizabeth's thinking. It was not a public scandal, not a constitutional crisis, and not even an argument witnessed by the nation. It was more intimate than that. A private boundary inside one of the Queen's most cherished homes was crossed. A sharp conversation followed, and Elizabeth left the encounter convinced that informal understandings were no longer enough. Elizabeth had always treated certain royal residences as more than property. They carried family memory, privacy, and a sense of continuity that stretched far beyond whoever happened to live there at the time. Balmoral, the royal family's private Scottish estate, held particular emotional weight because it was closely tied to personal family life rather than ordinary public duty. As Charles and Camilla's position became stronger, staff increasingly faced a practical question. Did her marriage give her automatic access to private royal spaces? Or did that access still depend on the sovereign's permission? Camilla tested that uncertainty during one private weekend at Balmoral. While Elizabeth was elsewhere in the residence, she asked to enter a restricted family sitting room containing personal correspondence, keepsakes, and objects tied to earlier generations. The staff member receiving the request hesitated. No permission had been recorded. Camilla pressed the point, believing her position beside Charles should be enough. The hesitation itself embarrassed her, but what followed turned that discomfort into something far deeper. Elizabeth confronted her later that evening in private. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The Queen told Camilla with chilling calm that marriage to the heir did not create ownership over every private space connected to the crown. She made clear that certain rooms belonged to family trust and sovereign permission, not assumption. Camilla defended herself, insisting she had meant no disrespect, but the conversation left her humiliated because Elizabeth's message was unmistakable. Elizabeth acted the next morning. According to a fictional documented account prepared by a senior aide, she asked for a formal mechanism to be drafted, preventing future royal spouses from assuming unrestricted personal access to designated residences. A formal mechanism, in plain language, meant a written rule strong enough to guide palace staff even after the monarch who created it was gone. The Queen wanted no future ambiguity. Anne later became part of that process. In a private recorded conversation preserved for this dramatized account, she watched her mother review the draft and remove a softer paragraph that allowed more flexibility. Elizabeth replaced it with a harder principle. Access should remain connected to invitation and duty, not marital status alone. Anne understood immediately that the wording was meant to survive personalities, arguments, and future pressure. Camilla now saw the past differently. The decree had not appeared from nowhere. It had grown out of that Balmoral confrontation, sentence by sentence, until an awkward private dispute became a permanent boundary. And with the origin finally exposed, she was no longer willing to simply absorb the modern consequences. The old wound had been reopened, and her next move was clear. She would face the people enforcing Elizabeth's decision and demand to know why they believed it still had to bind her now. Camilla entered the private meeting carrying more than anger. She carried years of compromise, scrutiny, and the belief that becoming queen had finally settled where she stood. Across the table, William remained calm but unyielding, while Anne watched closely, and Charles sat trapped between them. No press officers could soften what was coming. No careful palace language could hide the real question. Camilla wanted to know whether Elizabeth's decree was being honored or quietly turned into a weapon against her. William understood the danger of the meeting immediately. The discussion now had to decide which residences required invitation, which remained open during official engagements, and how far Charles could go in granting exceptions. An official engagement simply meant a formal royal duty carried out on behalf of the crown, and that distinction mattered because Camilla could still enter certain homes while working beside the king. The restriction only became painful when she acted independently. That was where family status and royal authority collided. Camilla turned directly toward William. She asked whether he truly believed she should stand outside royal homes as though she were an outsider waiting for permission. The prince paused before answering. He said the decree did not describe her as an outsider, but it did make one thing clear. Being queen did not mean every royal residence automatically became hers. His words were controlled, but the impact was immediate. Charles pushed his chair back. He told his son that language mattered when speaking about his wife, especially after everything she had endured to find acceptance inside the family. William softened his tone, but not his position. He insisted that changing the principle for one person could affect every future royal spouse. If Elizabeth had deliberately separated marriage from automatic access, then ignoring that distinction now would weaken the boundary she had created. Anne finally reached for the archived note she had brought with her. In a documented family record preserved for this dramatized account, she produced wording in Elizabeth's own hand stating that the decree should remain valid even if a future sovereign personally wished to expand access. An archived note, in plain language, is a preserved written record kept so later generations can understand the original intention behind a decision. Camilla stared at the page and realized the late queen had anticipated resistance. Anne then pointed to another line. The instruction clearly separated Charles inviting Camilla as his wife from Camilla holding permanent independent entitlement. The king could bring her with him. He could authorize entry. He could protect her dignity. But simply erasing the restriction would mean formally challenging the arrangement his mother had deliberately left behind. Camilla looked at Charles and asked the question that ended every other argument in the room. Would he use his authority to overturn the decree anyway? The king did not answer. His silence became the most powerful response of the meeting, because behind it lay a deeper truth. His crown gave him enormous authority, but Elizabeth had designed this boundary so that changing it would cost far more than opening a locked door. The confrontation made one fact impossible to ignore. This was never simply a fight over houses. It was a test of whether a monarch's wishes could survive the monarch herself. Charles had the crown. William had the future. Anne carried her mother's confidence, while Camilla now faced a system that separated public rank from private entitlement. Charles understood why the distinction mattered. The decree had been framed as a private royal property and household instruction, not as a parliamentary constitutional act. In simple terms, that meant it governed access, household authority, and specific royal residences, rather than changing anyone's legal place in the monarchy. He still held broad power over his own household, but several properties operated through different traditions, trusts, and crown-linked arrangements. That made a total cancellation far more complicated than simply signing another page. Charles remained alone with the file after the others left. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the document, and said nothing. The king knew exactly how a public reversal would look. It would appear that a son had deliberately dismantled his mother's final safeguard to protect his wife. Whatever his private feelings, that image would follow him. The cost was not only political, it was personal. Anne found him later and spoke without ceremony. She told her brother in a private recorded conversation for this dramatized account that Elizabeth's purpose had never been humiliation. The princess said her mother believed royal homes belonged to a chain of stewardship larger than any marriage. Stewardship, in plain language, meant holding something in trust for those who came before and those who would come after. That principle, Anne insisted, included the marriages of future kings as much as the present one. Anne then revealed the part that changed everything. Elizabeth had specifically insisted that the restriction apply consistently to future consorts, not only to Camilla. The queen consort may have been the immediate concern when the framework was drafted, but the rule had been written to outlive her. It was not supposed to disappear simply because the personalities changed. William recognized the significance at once. If the decree was enforced now, it created a precedent. A precedent is simply an earlier decision that becomes a guide for how similar situations are handled later. The prince understood that one day the same principle could restrict another royal spouse, even someone much closer to him. That realization removed any sense that this was only about punishing one woman. Charles finally made his choice. He would not destroy the decree, but he would interpret it as narrowly as possible. Wherever his authority allowed, Camilla would still enter with him, attend official duties, and receive standing invitations that protected her dignity. The rule would survive, but its sharpest edges would be softened. The decision was made. And by the following morning, Elizabeth's words stopped being a private argument on paper and began changing Camilla's daily life in ways she could no longer ignore. Royal power often reveals itself through ceremonies, signatures, and public declarations. But for Camilla, the new reality arrived through something much smaller: a door. No argument, no counsel, no raised voices. Just a familiar entrance. A staff member holding a revised access list, and the painful knowledge that yesterday she could pass without explanation. Today she could not. In that instant, Elizabeth's hidden decree stopped being history and became Camilla's daily life. Camilla had already been told the new rules, but hearing them and living under them were two different things. Palace staff had received revised access protocols explaining that she could still enter designated residences when accompanying Charles, attending an approved royal duty, or receiving direct authorization. An access protocol, in simple terms, was the set of instructions telling household and security staff who could enter and under what conditions. The palace wanted the change handled quietly, but keys, security clearances, and updated household lists made complete secrecy impossible. Camilla arrived before the king at one residence and moved toward the entrance, as she had done many times before. A staff member stepped forward and quietly asked her to wait while authorization was confirmed. She froze, only for a moment. Then she moved aside without protest, refusing to let embarrassment become spectacle. The queen consort knew the employee was following instructions, but that knowledge did nothing to soften the humiliation. Charles arrived soon afterward and understood immediately. He saw her waiting and did not need an explanation. Camilla told him she did not want staff blamed for obeying the new rules. She wanted something harder answered. Was this what standing beside him would now mean? Would every private movement become dependent on whether someone had properly recorded his permission? Charles finally explained the compromise he had chosen. In a documented private conversation prepared for this dramatized account, the king told her he would not cancel Elizabeth's decree. But wherever his own authority allowed, he would issue standing invitations, connecting her access to his presence and official household responsibilities. A standing invitation simply meant continuing permission that did not need to be requested again each time. It would remove many public moments of embarrassment without destroying the underlying rule. Camilla understood the truth beneath his reassurance. Most of her public life could continue almost unchanged, but Elizabeth's central message still survived. Her access flowed through the sovereign. It was not independently hers. That was the line the late queen had drawn, and Charles had chosen not to erase it. Something inside Camilla finally shifted. She stopped arguing about the document itself. Instead, she asked for one meeting, and this time she wanted no king, no Anne, no secretaries, and no advisors present. She wanted William alone. Once the anger had exhausted itself, something more dangerous and more honest remained. Camilla and William would finally have to speak, not as royal offices, but as two people shaped by the same complicated family. No aides waited beside them. No papers were spread across the table. For once, there was nothing between Camilla and William, except the history both had spent years learning to survive. She had been fighting Elizabeth's decree as an attack on her place in the family. William had been defending it as part of his grandmother's legacy. But when the titles disappeared from the conversation, both discovered that the deepest wound was not really about buildings at all. Camilla had asked for the meeting because she understood what continued resistance through Charles would do. Every new demand risked pushing father and son further apart, and she no longer wanted the decree to become the thing that reopened every old family fracture. William agreed for much the same reason. He wanted the conflict contained before private resentment spread across the wider family. Their history already carried enough weight from Diana, Charles's marriage, and the long struggle over Camilla's place beside him. Camilla spoke first. She told the prince that she had spent decades accepting that some people would never fully welcome her, no matter what title she held or how faithfully she served. But she had never expected to discover that Elizabeth had left behind a permanent boundary that could still reach into her life years later. The queen consort admitted that the hardest part was not the restriction itself. It was feeling that judgment had been preserved after the person who made it was gone. William listened without interrupting. He told her in a private recorded conversation for this dramatized account that he did not see the decree as revenge. The future king said his grandmother often showed affection through trust, but responsibility through limits. Those limits could hurt precisely because they were applied to people she cared about. Family memory, he explained, was not only emotional, it also shaped how the monarchy protected continuity from one generation to the next. Camilla then asked the question she had been holding back. Had William personally wanted the restriction activated? His answer came quickly. No. But once the condition had been triggered, he believed ignoring the decree would mean honoring Elizabeth only when her wishes were comfortable. That, he said, would turn loyalty into convenience. William then gave her something she had not expected. He promised that he would never use the decree to humiliate her publicly, isolate her within the family, or turn an inherited boundary into a personal weapon. The restriction would remain, but he would not make it cruel. Camilla absorbed that distinction quietly. For the first time, she stopped hearing the decree as an attack being carried out by William himself. Their agreement did not erase Elizabeth's decision, but it changed its emotional meaning. And just as the family reached that fragile understanding, the story slipped beyond palace walls, where the words, "Queen denied access," were about to ignite an entirely different judgment. By morning, the private compromise had vanished beneath a brutal public phrase, "The Queen locked out." The complicated distinction between independent access, official invitations, household authority, and Elizabeth's intentions collapsed into 5 sensational words. For Camilla, it was the humiliation she had feared from the beginning. For Charles, it was proof that a family boundary could become a national spectacle. And for William, it was the moment restraint became more important than victory. Camilla saw the coverage while sitting with Charles over breakfast. Palace communications officials had decided not to release the decree's full private wording, fearing that opening Elizabeth's confidential household instructions would create an even larger problem around royal papers never meant for public argument. A palace clarification, in simple terms, is an official statement used to explain a royal decision without revealing every private detail behind it. But the limited explanation left space for competing stories to spread quickly. Camilla pushed one newspaper away after reading the headline again. She told the king that the public would remember "locked out," not the careful distinctions everyone had spent days discussing. Some commentators framed the decree as Elizabeth protecting royal property and private family boundaries. Others described it as a final rejection of Camilla's independent place within the Windsor family. The Queen Consort understood how quickly a complex internal rule had been turned into a simple story of humiliation. Charles reacted with anger. He wanted a stronger statement defending his wife and rejecting the suggestion that she had been cast aside. Camilla stopped him. She told him that escalating the response would only make Elizabeth's decree look like a personal war between the living and the dead. The king hated the headline, but he understood her point. Every attempt to fight the late queen publicly risked making the controversy even more painful. Outside Buckingham Palace, the story took on a life of its own. A small crowd gathered as broadcasters discussed the restriction, and one television correspondent held up the front page carrying the words, "The Queen locked out." Behind the reporter, tourists photographed the gates, while people argued over what the headline really meant. That single moment turned the controversy into something larger than an internal royal disagreement. It became a public symbol of exclusion. Through a documented palace statement approved for this dramatized account, the prince confirmed that Camilla's ceremonial role and public standing remained unchanged. Her place beside Charles was not being removed. Her duties were not being stripped. The restriction applied only to independent access under the specific household rule Elizabeth had left behind. That clarification weakened the most explosive interpretation without exposing the private wording of the decree. Camilla read the statement and made her decision. She would not demand one final reversal. She would stop fighting for unrestricted access and decide for herself what Elizabeth's boundary would mean for the years ahead. The headlines had turned the decree into a symbol of exclusion, but her final response would determine whether that symbol ended in bitterness or became something far more unexpected. Camilla could have demanded that Charles fight until every restriction disappeared. She could have treated Elizabeth's decree as one final insult and forced the family to choose sides. Instead, after days of anger, humiliation, and painful confrontation, she made a quieter decision. The doors would remain subject to the late queen's conditions. She would keep her title, her duties, and her place beside the king, but she would stop measuring that place by unrestricted access to royal walls. Camilla accepted the final arrangement without pretending it no longer hurt. Elizabeth's decree remained intact, which meant she held no independent blanket entitlement to the designated royal homes. She could still enter them beside Charles, during approved duties, or through authorized invitations. An authorized invitation, in simple terms, meant formal permission connected to the sovereign or a recognized royal purpose. The distinction mattered because her public standing remained untouched, even while the private boundary stayed firmly in place. Charles accepted the arrangement as well. He would not attempt to erase his mother's instruction, and William and Anne agreed the rule should be administered quietly, consistently, and without humiliation. The king understood that preserving the decree did not mean preserving its harshest emotional impact. The prince understood that a precedent only had value if it was applied fairly. Anne understood that protecting Elizabeth's intention also meant preventing it from becoming a weapon. Camilla spoke privately with Charles one final time. She admitted that part of her still wished he could simply remove the restriction and make the entire conflict disappear. But she no longer wanted him forced to prove his love by destroying something his mother had deliberately left behind. The king took her hand and admitted that the decision had wounded him too. For once, neither tried to solve the pain, they simply accepted it. William later met Camilla before a family engagement. He offered no grand apology, and she demanded none. The future king told her she would be treated with dignity wherever the decree applied. Camilla answered that dignity mattered more now than pretending Elizabeth's boundary had never existed. That brief exchange settled what days of confrontation had failed to settle. The truth had finally become clear. Elizabeth's hidden instruction was never powerful simply because it could close a door. Its power came from the principle behind it. Even those closest to the sovereign did not automatically possess everything surrounding the crown. Camilla chose to live with that boundary rather than allow it to define her. The crisis ended without Camilla defeating the decree, and without the decree defeating her. Charles preserved his mother's instruction. William preserved the precedent. Anne protected the intention entrusted to her. And Camilla preserved something equally important, her dignity. Elizabeth's final boundary stayed exactly where she placed it. But the crown remained on Camilla's head, Charles remained at her side, and the closed doors became not the symbol of her defeat, but the limit she finally chose to accept. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.